let's keep going on that just idea of Lehi and Nephi and them fleeing Babylon or fleeing Jerusalem, because there's aspects to that tie into how the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the gospel. And what we see, because the Book of Mormon initially is an Old Testament document. It's in Old Testament times, 600 BC.
Yep.
Right? And what's happening? Babylon's coming to destroy Jerusalem.
Lehi has been warned.
Meaning everything is going to become corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm pretty sure, if I remember my history correctly, that like Zedekiah was already installed illegally as part of like the conquest that was going on. So there was already corruption coming into Jerusalem politically.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that has influence spiritually, religiously. And of course this is at a time where Jerusalem had been going through a huge reformation because they had lost the law and they had found it again. And they had become very strict adherents to the law because they had just been so excited that they found the original books in the law. So there's a lot of cool history, like that is just context behind the Book of Mormon that it's not explicitly explained in the Book of Mormon. You have to kind of understand what was going on in Jerusalem at the time. But we know that corruption was coming, and that's the reason to get out, because the truths were going to be lost.
Mm-hmm.
The freedom of religion that they were able to practice was not going to be available, and therefore there was not a mechanism, there was not an organization or a framework for true prophets and the spirit of prophecy to keep the church together, to keep truth being practiced correctly. So what happened? God called a prophet, Lehi, to flee. And what do we see happening with the family of Lehi when they flee the temple? Well, we see parallels from other parts of the Old Testament going on there. Right, the whole aspect of fleeing, right, for Jerusalem, it's an exodus. Mm-hmm. So we have Lehi, who was like a Moses figure, and we have Nephi, who's kind of a David figure. So just like how David killed Goliath, cut off his head, right? We have Nephi, who killed Laban, cut off his head.
Yeah. Let me add a couple more points to that, too. It's interesting that Moses, who was in Pharaoh's court, and was actually, because he was Pharaoh's second son now, albeit adopted, was essentially going to be the spiritual leader of Egypt at that time. He would be essentially the high priest of the Egyptian priesthood, of the Egyptian religion at that time. He denied all that. He gave up all of that power that he could have had so that he could lead this exodus. Let's consider Lehi now. Lehi was extremely wealthy. We know this, which meant he was probably very well educated. His sons were probably very well educated. It's very likely that had they stuck around when Babylon invaded...
Nephi was literate.
Yeah, like he knew what he was talking about.
Nephi had to read the scriptures to his brothers because they were not literate. So
they were not nobodies in Jerusalem. They were somebodies in Jerusalem.
But Nephi specifically, obviously, because it was not common for everyone to be literate.
Right.
You were literate if you were trained for a purpose or a trade. Mm-hmm. Right. So obviously Nephi was being trained, right, to be a scribe.
Yeah.
Because he was literate and knew the scriptures very well.
And what would have happened when Babylon comes in? What did they do with those who were wealthy, with those who were educated, with those who had skills? They didn't just kill them. They didn't just slaughter them. No, they took them back, and those people were essentially indoctrinated with the ways of the world, with Babylon, right? And so Nephi and Lehi were preserved. We'll give you special
status in the new order if you get with our program. And
and they were preserved from that, because they chose to what? Flee. Same thing with Moses.
Because if you didn't, they would kill you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's kind of gun to your head, like, hey, you're going to do this? Well, yeah, I guess so. What choice do I have?
So we see truth being lost and God preserving truth in the same way that he had established his truth to begin with. We see a Moses figure, we see prophetic, we see a Davidic figure in Nephi, which is like kingly
Yeah.
authority, essentially. We have
So much so that his brothers even accuse him of wanting to be a king and a ruler over them.
Right.
He had that aura about him.
They went back and got the plates, the books of Moses, the law of Moses,
Yep.
just like Moses had revealed the law and the Ten Commandments. They had, and then they had other relics that they accumulated along the way. The
Sword of Laban.
Sword of Laban, the Liahona, through the Jaredites and everything. We had the breastplate and the Urim and Thummim. Right, these were all things that were accumulated and they carried with them. And then what do we see Lehi doing along the way? Well, we see him building altars and worshiping. We see him establishing, in essence, a tabernacle, right? He dwelt in a tent, and he was establishing altars, and he was performing temple rites.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had authority, apparently Melchizedek authority, because he was officiating these things under the tribe of Joseph. We
got to add too that Lehi not only financially was well off and was somebody in Jerusalem, but he not only was he called as a prophet of God, but that meant he had authority to perform certain actions and certain deeds. Like it wasn't accidental that he was able to carry these temple rites with him into the wilderness with his family through his patriarchal calling, right? Through the patriarchal priesthood he had. He was actually authorized to take the temple rites with him into the wilderness and continue to allow that knowledge and that form of worship to continue and to move forward, just as Moses did.
So, essentially, they, just like the tabernacle of Moses had certain relics that had symbolic meaning, right? The Nephites were establishing their own relics, their own tabernacle, and they were preserving the temple rites. That was their calling, was to preserve the temple rites so they would not go into apostasy and be lost from the earth when Jerusalem's conquered. And they were called right to the Americas because part of everything they were doing was also fulfilling promised blessings to Joseph of Egypt through his descendants, through his seed, to receive that inherited, that promised land through his posterity. But that's one of the reasons why the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the gospel, because it places the temple and the preservation of the temple and the importance of the temple in the forefront. And it's actually one of the criticisms that got proven right along the way, is that there was criticisms that, like, Lehi was like building altars and doing temple worship outside the temple of Jerusalem. Like
that's not allowed.
Yeah, that's not allowed. But then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there was a book of the temple that actually had exceptions that when you're 3 days journey away from Jerusalem, it's permitted to perform things on a local level.
Which is exactly what Lehi says they do.
Which is exactly, like Lehi specifically traveled through, says 3 days and built an altar.
Yeah.
Just, again, we'll go back into apologetics, but it's fascinating. It's just fascinating that these things are like so perfectly like aligned.
In sync, yeah.
In sync. And then Joseph Smith, when he was called to find the plates, he digs up essentially a box of sorts, and all of these relics were in this box. He discovered an Ark of the Covenant, the Nephite Ark of the Covenant.
Yep.
That would have been in the Holy of Holies in the Nephite temple. And of course, when they make it to the Americas, what do they say? They began building temples after the order of the Temple of Solomon, the best they could. So the temple, like the Book of Mormon, is the fullness of the gospel, because we learn of the importance and the central focus of temple rites, of the temple, to the covenant people of God. And that's just so important. Like the temple is everything to the gospel.
Yeah.
It always has been and always was, right? Even Jesus focused on the temple.
Cleansing it.
From a young age, he was teaching in the temple. He was focused on cleansing, maintaining the purity of the temple. Even with his death and renting the veil, like the crucial and key moment of the atonement and his death on the cross and renting, like, he specifically chooses to make a symbolic act in the temple. And then, of course, compares his body and resurrection to the temple.
Right.
Everything is focused on the temple. And of course, we know today that the temple still is in God's and in Christ's church the central focus and the main way that we receive the keys of the priesthood to truly gain our personal relationship with God and come back into his presence and receive our salvation and exaltation.
And Christ did not come to overthrow or do away with the temple and with temple rites. That's absolutely not what he was there to do. In fact, as you mentioned, was trying to purify and cleanse the temple to maintain what was supposed to be going on in the temple. But what happened is it was rejected. Mm-hmm. The temple and ultimately what it was meant or designed for was rejected by those who should have been upholding the ordinances performed within the temple. And so because of that, the consequences of that is those temple rites in the old world were essentially lost. It became apostate. There were no more temple rites available because of the agency used to reject them. Well, we don't see that in the Book of Mormon and in the New World, at least for a longer period of time. Those temple rites and the focus on the temple continued up through essentially the end of the Book of Mormon when, kind of all hell breaks loose, literally. So it was central to everything in the Book of Mormon.
And meanwhile, the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, and it still is.
Yeah, exactly.
To this day.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Even with the restoration of the Jews to Israel, to Jerusalem, they still have not restored their temple.
Yep.
And that's what God was doing. He was preserving it, and with all that, we have so much truth reserved through the plates and through those prophets that were sent to preserve those things. Just amazing. And there's other temple themes. I mean, there's temple themes throughout the entire Book of Mormon. It's King Benjamin, right? Very clearly, with him in the center, and everyone and all the families turning their tents
towards the temple,
essentially towards the temple, right? Towards the prophet, towards the source of revelation that they have. That's very clearly temple themes. Importance of genealogy, of ancestry.
Yeah,
is all throughout the Book of Mormon. Law of consecration, King Benjamin.
You got to give it all, man.
I mean, he's what an amazing discourse on the law of consecration.
Yep.
And
all throughout the Book of Mormon, we see if you don't give to the poor, the needy, if you turn away and don't provide for those in need, then you're good for nothing. I mean, you're never going to receive all that the Father has in store for you. And so there's this constant theme throughout the Book of Mormon of give everything to the Lord, and you'll receive more than you deserve in return, right? And that's essentially what law of consecration leads to, is inheriting all that the Lord has to give.
Somewhere along the way, I heard a criticism of the Book of Mormon. They're like, if it contains the fullness of the gospel, why doesn't it have why doesn't it contain the temple ordinances like it does the sacrament ordinances?
Yeah.
There's things, and again, we go back to what does the fullness of the gospel mean as it pertains to the Book of Mormon. It's a much greater scope. The purpose, the saying that the Book of Mormon contains the fullness does not mean that the Book of Mormon contains all truth.
Yeah.
That's not the point. Having said that, a lot of those ordinances are in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. They're just not in your face.
It's not there's sacred things are not necessarily put out on display.
It's appropriate to keep sacred things sacred.
There's actually there's journal entries of people who saw the plates that talked about how there was sacred geometry associated with the plates of the Book of Mormon, meaning there was a compass and square on the plates, on the cover plates of the Book of Mormon, which is not something that you hear about or is talked about. It's really interesting, but it clearly shows that there were Joseph Smith was and could have been and was taught many things related to the temple, like from the beginning when he got the plates of the Book of Mormon, that maybe did not come into play with the restoration until many years later.
Yeah.
Like just because certain things wasn't on the record or in the record and in the translation of the Book of Mormon, he was still being taught by angels along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And he was being given he was being taught truth and true scripture and true interpretations by the ministry of angels, right, in parallel to translating, publishing the Book of Mormon, but also establishing the church. So, right, part of the fullness of the gospel is the ministry of angels, is a living prophet, is the framework and proper organization for these things to come to pass. And having, through revelation and through proper priesthood keys, all of those saving ordinances necessary to enter into the presence of God.
Yeah.
And, I mean, if you think about it, how many times in the Book of Mormon do people come into the presence of Christ?
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, too, if you think about, for those who are initiated and familiar with the covenants we make in the temple, and those aren't secret. The church publishes those now on our website. I mean, we're open about these are the covenants we make in the temple.
Well, I mean, let's just obedience.
Obedience, law of obedience.
Law of sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
Okay, that's the like Mosaic law.
Yep.
Okay.
Law of the gospel.
Law of the gospel.
Christ, the higher law.
Jesus.
Yep. Law of chastity.
Law of chastity.
Yep.
Obvious.
Yep.
Like that shouldn't like surprise anybody.
Law of consecration.
Law of consecration.
Yep.
I mean, that's most clearly Doctrine and Covenants, but Jesus taught that very clearly. Young rich man.
All of these.
We've talked about it. It always comes up.
All of these laws, the covenants we're making.
Law of consecration is actually in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Like it's in there.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't new. Like Jesus wasn't like bringing something that was like a shocker.
Well,
that you should take care of the poor and like not like put all your heart into wealth. Like that shouldn't have been like revolutionary. But
I think
because they were so corrupted.
When people criticize, like, why aren't all the temple rites, detailed out in the Book of Mormon? Well, you're focusing on the wrong thing here.
Well,
all of the covenants.
In reality, it's just a poorly constructed
It is
criticism.
a poor argument. But in reality, the things that matter, the covenants, which is where power is given, the covenants we make in the temple, all 5 of those are perfectly contained within the Book of Mormon. All of those things are well taught, well versed, and outlined to where you can't misunderstand each of these things and how to live them and apply them into your life. Like they're all clearly addressed within the Book of Mormon.
Well, and what is the purpose of living the laws of God, and learning to live higher laws? What's the purpose? Well, it's because we want to become like Jesus Christ, so we can be with Jesus Christ. We can be one with him, and we can enter into his presence and come unto him, or that he may come unto us. We want to enter into the presence of God. And, of course, we desire that eternally after this life. But one of the great revealing aspects of the fullness of the gospel that we get clearly from the Book of Mormon is that men can come into the presence of God, come into the presence of Christ. And of course, that's the fullness of the temple, and that's the whole purpose, right? Even from the tabernacle, right? The whole going through into the Holy of Holies, right, is entering into the presence of God. That was the high priest on the Day of Atonement, but with the veil rent, that's available to all of us, right? The temple is now an integral part of the gospel for each individual son and daughter of God. And that's all throughout the Book of Mormon, starting with Nephi.
Well, and when we've talked about this before, one of the most basic things, but yet overlooked so often about the Book of Mormon, and just a basic core teaching of the Book of Mormon, is what is at the center, what is at the heart of the Book of Mormon? Christ himself ministered to the people of the Americas in the flesh. We forget that the Book of Mormon is a witness that Christ is actively engaged in and will manifest himself to each of us in the flesh if we seek him out. Does that mean he's going to come down and stand before me? Maybe, maybe not. He could if he wanted to. There's nothing stopping him from doing that. But the point is this communion with him where you can come to know him just as well as if he stood directly in front of you. That's one of the most beautiful things about Bruce R. McConkie in his last General Conference talk, where at the end he talks about all of these things he knows through the Spirit about Jesus Christ and his Savior. And he outright admits, when I see Christ in the flesh, I will not have any greater knowledge or any greater belief or faith in him than I do now. He already had that witness.
I will not know him any better than I do now.
Yes, exactly right. And that is what the Book of Mormon is teaching us, is you can know Christ just as well as those who lived through his mortal ministry, because he appeared to those who were in the Americas. He revealed himself to those people. And that's the core of the Book of Mormon, is Christ is seeking to reveal himself to you individually. And that's what we're trying to harness by going to the temple, by living those covenants, by exercising those ordinances and principles in our life, is to allow Christ to more perfectly manifest himself unto us individually.
One of the most beautiful representations of that is the brother of Jared, which is among the earliest records of God's children that we have. But what do we see? We see the brother of Jared, again, being called out of Babylon. But through his faith and through the person that he was and the laws that he lived, right, he was worthy to go unto the Lord, seek revelation, receive it, serve a prophetic role, but ultimately, his faith, his worthiness, pierced the veil and allowed him to see the finger of the Lord, to the point where the Lord could no longer veil himself from the brother of Jared.
Yes.
And he came into the presence of Christ, or Christ came into his presence. And it's just, that's the temple. That's the temple. And I was talking about this with a little while back with one of our missionaries, and I kind of was talking about this, and he, you could see that things were clicking in his head, and he was just loving it. And he was like, so the brother of Jared that, is like him receiving his endowment. And I said, the brother of Jared is using his endowment.
Yeah.
Is exercising
that gift he's received. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not just receiving it, it's making use of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Making use of what you're given.
Applying what you've received.
To make it into the presence of the Lord. And that's the fullness of the gospel. There it is. Right? Nephi did the same thing.
Yep.
He was taken up into visions and then came into the presence of the Lord. It's all throughout the Book of Mormon. You see it in the Bible too.
Yeah.
But it's a central theme over
It's
and
so
over
plain and precious in the
Yes.
Book of Mormon. Yeah.
Right, and the fact that the narratives of the Book of Mormon starts with like a normal family with Nephi and shows that these are like normal people that are tapping into these blessings.
Mm-hmm.
How relatable is that? Like it's so clear that this is for each of us individually.
Yeah.
That's the fullness of the gospel, is to make ourselves at one with the Father.
The whole aspect of that there is so much light and truth that the Lord is gifting to you if you will receive it. It literally, it breaks my heart when I see people that go to the temple and I talk to them about it and I can see it hasn't had the effect on them yet that perhaps I know it can have on them. And some people, because of that, they just slowly drift away and they don't go as often because they haven't truly sought it by revelation, as the temple says. It's given by revelation. You've got to receive it by revelation. And we're certainly not going to reveal anything that, would be inappropriate, or saying this is the end all be all, but just some perspectives on how to put certain things in the temple in just a different perspective, and maybe help you think about, well, how can this draw me to Christ personally and individually?
One of the most important steps in the process of understanding and getting meaningful insight from the temple is just talking about it or thinking about it.
Yeah.
Right? It's just pondering on it. Right? So even if we're talking high level, or we're talking generally about principles and doctrines and concepts, right? It's if you're just thinking about it and pondering on it, letting that Spirit work within you, right? That's how you do it. When have I learned the most about the temple ordinances and the endowment and what it means to me and how I can apply it in my life? Well, it's when I was going weekly and having constant reminders and access to the words of those ordinances. It was always in my mind. It was so easy to be thinking about it and pondering on it because I was always going.
Yeah.
And I think that would probably be the purpose is it's just one more outlet, another insight, another opinion, another way of thinking about it. Yeah. The more you stand in holy places and put yourself around that kind of information, right? The actual information itself is of less importance than the spirit and environment you're creating for the Holy Ghost to reveal things to you, yep. for you to learn things through the Spirit and not necessarily from other men.
Yeah.